Well, I'm Annie Collins. I'm a film editor, and I began editing around when I was 28, was when I cut my first film. And it would have been about 7 years later that I began working with Merata on her documentary PATU on the Springbok tour. There was no formal training in film editing outside of TVNZ or the National Film Unit at that time. And because neither of them or Pacific Films were interested in me turning up on their door and going, oh, I'd like to be a film editor, I was in fact trained completely independently, and possibly of that generation, the first independently trained editor in the country, and a tutor from the Polytechnic where I cut my first film. He suggested that if I could keep myself alive, he would give me the training. And so I did that. I carried 3 jobs and worked for him during the day. And pretty quickly, I sort of graduated. He was an excellent teacher. That was Pat Cox. And he was a superb teacher, very, very generous with his knowledge and his time. And I learnt all of the technical film knowledge that I needed to have. It was 1975, the end of 1975, when he took me on. There were a number of long documentaries that I did. And one of the reasons that I got them was because basically there were no independent editors available in the country except for Pat Cox and myself. Everybody else worked for television, or they worked for the National Film Unit, or they worked for Pacific Films or Peach Weems. So they were employees. So when the new generation of New Zealand films began with Solo, with Tony Williams and Sleeping Dogs, they were looking for independent people to crew them. How I came on board with PATU, all the feeling and the actions were ramping up for the Springbok tour. I actually went travelling in 1981, and I left just before the tour started, and I came back after it had ended. When I was travelling, I went on the Trans-Siberian from Japan up to Nakhodsk on the east, and travelled right across Russia on the Trans-Siberian, and hit Leningrad and Moscow. And when I entered this huge, big tourist hotel in Moscow, it was marble everywhere, and a huge reception area. And I was handing over my passport and signing the paper, doing the registration stuff. And I could hear this noise going on in the background. And it was kind of familiar. It didn't, because it was so familiar, it didn't register to begin with. And then I heard this roar go up. And I looked over, and there's this group of people clustered over in maybe 30 yards away across this enormous place. And I went over and pushed through the crowd, and there was the break-in at Hamilton.
protest break-in at Hamilton's Rugby Park. Here's Graham Moody at the park.
The demonstrators arrived at the ground just a short while ago. They marched past the main gate, and then just a few seconds later we saw them pouring through the crowd and onto the ground. At the moment there's a group of around 500 tourists, or over 500 demonstrators anyway, grouped in the centre of the ground. They're standing arm in arm with a police escort around them.
And that front row were chanting, "The whole world's watching." And it was. It was. It was extraordinary. Yeah. I'd never been on a march. I had, apart from that little bit of footage in Moscow, I had seen no coverage whatsoever. After Moscow, I followed it in the newspapers in London. And then when I returned, Gerd had spoken with Merata by then, I think, to suggest that I would be a good person to edit for her. It was not all sunk up. I think Gerd did some of the sinking, but there was some the syncing up of that material was an enormous job, because nobody pissed about with having nice clappers going so that you could tell what sound went with what picture and whereabouts in the picture it went with it. I used to ask the sound guys just to run the sound. Just keep running, whether there's clappers on it or whatever, just so long as you've got tape, just keep running, because the picture would chop in and out, because that was the expensive part of it, the really expensive part. But sound on documentary, if you wanted authentic, the actual feel of a documentary situation, you needed the sound from that event.
Take the grandstand. Crowd refusing to go. Chant, "We want rugby."
That's basically what had happened much of the time with PATU. The sound guys were just running most of the time. It was a challenging edit with the handling of that amount of footage and the state that it was in. It was challenging, but it was really, really interesting working with that sort of challenge, that sort of technical detail. And it's part of what I love about my work. Put it another way, I'm really, really good at jigsaw puzzles and patchwork quilts. Just finding the detail and matching it. So the technical stuff really interested me. That was, in fact, the easiest part of it. It's when you actually come to put the material together. It wasn't a matter of making a really dramatised documentary as you'll often see now, where everything serves the drama of the film. This footage was drama in itself. And what Merata was very, very clear about, and I'd never met anybody before that time who was so cognizant of the fact that she was preparing an historical document. She understood that really, really clearly, and that was her kaupapa.
Crowd here at Rugby Park, Hamilton, have had our guts full. Look at the bottles and cans flying out of the grandstand.
As we began a sequence, I would turn to her and go, how did this feel? What happened? What was the feeling like? And she could tell me that quite specifically, in detail. And then I'd turn back to the bench and cut that feeling. And that happens for every sequence. There was a lot of backlash to Merata. A lot of it was in terms of why is this woman getting this footage? Why is everybody giving their footage to her? Why is she going to be the one who's going to be making it? And the criticism was that if she directed the film, it would be biased to Māori. And she was fierce about that. She said the opposite holds. If it's cut by a Pākehā, it'll be biased to Pākehā. I, at least, am bicultural. And so, yes, she was the right person. And she went where other people did not dare to go. She tied apartheid into the racism in New Zealand. And she put it up on screen and named it. Important thing, I think, which Pākehā need to think about. We live our lives here in privilege. And whether we wish to do that, that has no relevance. We have privilege. We're born with it. How we use that privilege, that is the choice. I could walk out of the door of Merata's house and I could go home and I could go inside my house and I could shut the door. And I could leave all of that outside. People like Merata can't. They cannot shut their door. It's in the house with them. It's in everything. It came to a point where I understood really clearly that this person who was in this chair beside me basically lived in a different country. I had no idea about it. And I couldn't do my job with this footage unless I understood this other nation that I lived alongside and never looked at. So I was not actually adequate for that footage. But there wasn't another Māori editor around that I knew of, or Merata knew of. When I look at PATU now, with the 40 years of experience that I have gained since that time, I'm really pleased. I'm thankful that I didn't know what I now know, that I didn't have the experience that I now have. If I were cutting it now, that film would have become much smoother and tidier. It's raw. It's as raw as I was. at that time. I'd been cutting film for 6 or 7 years, 7 years or something by then, by the time I took that on. And believe me, that's not a lot of time. I'm glad it looks like it does. I'm really pleased.
We have not been intimidated by barbed wire. We have not been scared off by the Red Squad. Despite every attempt to threaten and to silence the voice of the people, we have not been silenced.